أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله ملء السماوات والأرض عالم الغيب والشهادة والرحمن الرحيم رب المستضعفين والمظلومين وناصر المجاهدين الفدائيين واستشهاديين وخاصم الجبارين والطغاة والظالمين وصلى اللهم على حبيبه إله العالمين الرسول المسدد والعبد المؤيد المصطفى الأمجد أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى آل الطاهرين الطيبين المعصومين لا سيما على شهيد كربلاء سيد الشهداء أبي عبد الله الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين الذين بذلوا مهجهم دون الحسين وعلى أصحاب رسول الله المنتجبين وعلى جميع أنبياء الله والمرسلين. Respected brothers and sisters, on this 9th night of Tasu'a, this 9th night of Muharram, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. In the time and minutes and moments of sadness, of pain, of mourning and deep reflection, we thank Allah that we are able to commemorate and sit together to reflect on this great sacrifice by Imam al-Hussein and his companions and in the deserts of Karbala in Al-Iraq during these nights that led to the 10th day of Muharram. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma inna nashku ilayka faqda nabiyina wa ghaybata imamina. In Dua al-Iftitah we read, and at the end of Dua al-Iftitah we say, oh Allah, we complain to you and we put in front of you our grievance. Our grievance is the loss of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who passed away, of course, and the ghaiba of our Imam and the Imam who is in occultation. What it means, and we're asking Allah for succor. We're asking Allah to give the oppressed and the dispossessed masses of the world a way out with leadership. Mawla Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali bin Abi Talib alayhi salam speaks. He says there are three categories of people. He says Alimun Rabbani, that a scholar who fears God and who is aware of God. Second type of person, Muta'allimun ala sabilin najat. It is a student, a person who seeks knowledge in order to save him or herself, to have a good and righteous life in this world and to be successful in the life to come. And then Hamajun Ru'a, and he speaks about, but then there are people, many or most of people who are and who blow as the wind blow. Ali bin Abi Talib was not being unkind to any person. He was not condescending to any person. He was describing a reality. But if the first group, if they do their work, therein lies the liberation and the salvation of the third group of people. And if we reflect on our world today, we see that most of us fit in the third category. That does not mean we are bad. That does not mean we are useless. That does not mean that we have no good. We know that our fitra, that all of insan is created with good, our natural disposition. But it means our social and political reality wherein we live. Unfortunately, this socio-political reality is the product of those few people who exactly wish to rob us of our human dignity, and they have taken over us. And therefore we often find ourselves falling in the third category. Now we know in our world today, and to come to our context today, we know that there is a problem in our world. We can see it. Nobody is blind to that reality. We know that there are many problems. And the biggest problem is that our human dignity has been taken away from us. We also know that we need to search for in order to find the solution. So there's a problem we know. We know that we need a solution. We also desire the solution with deep sincerity as human beings. But do we know really what the problem is? For if we do not know what the problem is, we become unable, or we are not able to find the solution, even with our deep sincerity and our desire to bring about change. So in order to have the solution, to diagnose the problem, so to speak, and in order to give the solution, we need knowledge, we need guidance, we need leadership, fearless and sincere leadership. For the Muslims, this question of leadership has been the most pressing issue. Therefore, the 6th century Muslim scholar Shaheed said, "Inna a'dam al-khilaf bayna al-ummat al-islamiyya khilaf al-imama." The greatest controversy, the biggest controversy and cause of internecine fighting, of consternation amongst the Ummah of Islam is this issue of leadership. And he says, never has a sword been taken out on any issue as on the issue of leadership and imamah. And I think that's equally true for all peoples of the world. The problem today is that we must have a leadership that is sincere, that is wise, that understand what the issues are, that can diagnose and explain to us what the problems are, and from there move to find solutions. Now, in light of what is called the Arab Spring, and we prefer the word as-sahwa al-islamiyya, this Islamic awakening, in light of what is happening in South Africa, our own country, one has to look at the issue in order to say, how do we understand what is happening in our world and what is the way forward? I do not have much time, but I want to look at one issue, see how we can possibly try to understand this issue and to see the leadership that is given on that issue. And when I say so, that no leadership, however good it is, a perfect leadership. Perfection, a good leadership does not mean perfection. And that a leadership is not perfect does not mean that it is compromised on the genuine aspirations of human beings. I want to just quickly look at the question of Syria today, because this is a very, very important one. Of course, 10 minutes can never do justice to it. Let me also say, I'm not a political analyst, but let us just very lightly look over Syria. I speak also about Syria because I had my own ambivalence regarding the uprising in Syria. At one stage, I was myself rather disappointed, and was one of the people that thought that maybe we should write specifically to say Hassan Nasrullah Hafidahullah, the son of the Prophet of Allah, being from the lineage of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and saying that perhaps we should write a letter to speak about what is happening in Syria. Now let us be clear that as in many, many other places, there are genuine aspirations of the peoples of all these places. There are people who have genuine demands, and those should be met in Syria and elsewhere. However, that is exactly to start with, that we need to understand the problem in its entirety, and not only from a certain perspective, lest we get misguided in the process. Now let me say something about Syria. We've seen what is happening in Syria. Apparently in Syria, more people have died, as we hear, than any other place, except of course what was said about Libya, that 50,000 people have been killed by al-Qaddafi. And we know now that is not true. That has been manufactured. But we may ask, especially as followers of Ahlul Bayt, and especially because we look up to Sayyid Hassan Nasrullah, and we ask, but why is that this defense of the Assad government of Bashar al-Assad in the Syrian regime as a whole? And how do we understand this process? Now I have a paper by one scholar, and taking much from this paper, just to say, one of the most important things to diagnose the problem is that we have to understand, when we look at these uprisings in the Muslim world towards this as-sahwa al-islamiyya, this Islamic awakening, is that we have to view things against the backdrop of the regional struggle between the nationalist and resistance project led by countries such as Iran, Syria, and the movement Hezbollah and Hamas. They are also known as the Resistance Exodus or Jabha al-Mumana'a. So now we ask, and in light of that we have to understand the support that Hezbollah and Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah is continuation for the Syrian position. One must understand, says this author, that Hezbollah's understanding of freedom as a positive freedom means to control one's destiny and to achieve self-determination. Now this understanding of freedom both digresses from and surpasses the liberal preoccupation with the negative freedom from external constraints and hindrances. In other words, the freedoms that liberal democracy speaks about. You can decide your own sexuality, who you sleep with, what you do. Those liberal freedoms, and of course liberal freedom is not only about that, but the fact that you can vote. In other words, that freedom for Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah is a positive freedom. To be free from the interference of the imperialists and their onslaughts on the Muslim lands. It is not simply freedom to be able to smoke ganja or dacha somewhere on Table Mountain and say that I am free. I do not mean to trivialize what are individual freedoms, but often we must see this type of freedom to be the quest for people in Syria, at least some of them. So Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah is clear that no one denied that Syria and the Syrian government is not making mistakes, because it does make its mistakes. In fact, it made its mistakes in other parts, even in Lebanon. Now there's an accusation against Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah that is applying double standards. He supported, they say, all the uprisings in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Yemen, in Al-Bahrain, but when it comes to Syria, the accusation is that Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah has adopted double standards. Now he has not adopted double standards, but in order to understand that, we must understand this notion of positive freedom. In other words, freedom from interference by foreign powers. People often forget that it took Europe 400 years in its struggle for democracy. And democracy and liberalism are not the same thing. We must not confuse the two. They are not the same thing. And Europe took 400 years at least, starting from the religious reformation in the 15th century. And nobody stood at the doors of Europe. Nobody wanted Europe's mineral wealth when Europe was busy with its quest for freedom and the rule of law, etc. In other words, it was an entire internal development. How can you have real development when there are so many vested interests and powers from the outside standing to interfere in Syria, in Iran, in Lebanon, and indeed every country in the world, even our own country? We know that our revolution was cheated in this country because of these powers, because of the multinational companies that stood to gain maximum benefit. Just very quickly, coming back to this question of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah's double standards, especially its relationship to the Syrian government, people often forget. A point that is overlooked is Hezbollah's own experience of repression at the hands of the very Syrian government. For example, in 1987, Syrian forces gunned down 23 Hezbollah fighters in cold blood in Beirut. The same happened in 1993. But why did Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah then keep quiet? Because the struggle against Israeli aggression was what was the cause. So Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah left the issue with the Syrians because what was important was the resistance priority to precedence. Because Syria never compromised. People often say that Syria is not fighting against Israelis in the Golan Heights. That is true. You do not look unnecessarily for wars. But Syria never compromised. It is the only Arab country that stands firmly against Israel. So Hezbollah was willing to overlook the Syrian regime's violence against itself. If we understand that, then we are able to see and understand why Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, as much as he's paying at Hezbollah, what is happening in Syria, will not now open up a war against Syria. Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, in fact, did that with the US invasion of Afghanistan. We all know what Saddam was. We know that Saddam killed so many, including Sheikh Hassan Nasrullah's teacher, indirectly, this Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. Yet on the night of the invasion, Sayyid Nasrullah called for reconciliation between the Iraqi Shia opposition and this Saddam regime along the lines of the Lebanese Taif Accord. What was happening here, Sayyid Hassan Nasrullah said, Saddam is a problem, Saddam is an enemy, but the bigger enemy is the Israeli-American alliance. So those who are critical of Sayyid Hassan Nasrullah often forget all these things, and therefore there is no double standards. Let me just say, finally in this, that Hezbollah's conception of rights and freedom, and it believes in rights and freedom, but it also says that that the resistance is not a right because it was launched by the people. Rather, it is a right because it is a freedom-seeking notion. In other words, to Sayyid Hassan Nasrullah, that collective rights, that freedom from imperialism, takes precedence over the individual freedom of one to vote, and simply to vote, and to vote in an American company. As he said, the USA does not worry when Marxist, Leninist, or even an Islamist government comes to power, as long as they can control it, as they, the USA, and can ensure that Israel has security. That is what you see is happening in Egypt. Yes, the Islamic parties won, but the military is still ruling firmly in Egypt. Now, respected brothers and sisters, I think that is leadership. Not perfect, but it is guided. It is sincere. And it is based on what Sheikh Hamza yesterday spoke about, tazkiyah, self-purification. It is based on al-ikhlas, on sincerity, etc. And therefore, when Sayyid Hassan Nasrullah takes that decision, it's based on leadership. It's based on understanding the problem, having diagnosed the problem, and being able to move therefrom to give the solution. So we have a good leadership here. We have the correct leadership here. And so therefore, we have this leadership starting with Al-Imam Al-Khomeini rahmatullah alayhi. Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr could say, Dhubu fil Khomeini kama dhaba huwa fil Islam. He says, absolve yourself in Al-Khomeini as Al-Khomeini absolved himself in Islam. Islam is always the yardstick. The Quran is always the yardstick. So, respected brothers and sisters, in light of this, what we're trying to say, that we can only understand what is happening in our world if we have leadership, and we think, and we must engage with our leadership. We have to give our advice. We have to tell them what we think. They must do what they must do. They have absolute conviction in their political positions, but it does not nevertheless mean they're perfect. Finally, that is what Karbala was all about. 73 mu'mineen. It does not mean that there were only 73 Muslims. There were many more than 73 Muslims, of course, mu'mineen. But only 73 understood, and they were under the greatest leadership. Only those 73 understood what the problem was. And they had an Imam in Mansour, a great Imam, who would lead them onto the absolute path of righteousness. That was Al-Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam. And it's these people who in 61 Hijri went to Karbala. Leadership was intact. It was a sincere one, a muttaqi one, a one guided by Allah. And there were followers who understood their Imam. Imam Hussein had many other supporters, those who had all sympathy with him, but did not go with him. Those 73 were the people, and not only 73 fighters, but the women and also the children, that even Ar-Radiyya Abdullah Ali Asghar we speak about, understood, so that he could also say, almost communicate to his father, even though he could not speak, Inna Aliyan sha'a an yara nafsahu qatilan kama sha'Allah an yarahu qatilan. That all those markers said, we wish to see ourselves killed in this battle for real freedom, for real love, as Allah wishes to see us killed. And so, respected brothers and sisters, if we have this in place, if we have leadership in place, we understand the problem, and then, inshallah, we are able, through our leadership, to find the solution. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.